Hello, everyone. It is so wonderful to have you. I'm pleased and thrilled to announce that this is our second speaker of Meaningful. My name is Rachel, and I'm here from the Typeform team. And today I'd love to introduce Professor Liz Stokoe. She is a professor of social interaction at Loughborough University. She uses conversation analysis to understand how conversation works, from first dates to medical communication, and from sales encounters to hostage negotiation. At Typeform, we were so lucky to have Liz for 6 months. She was an industry fellow, really helping us to optimize our conversationalities and make sure that we were delivering the best on our platform. And today, we're pleased to have her speaking about physically distanced, socially close, meaningful interactions in a time of coronavirus. And before we get started, just one housekeeping note. If you can please use the Q&A to ask questions, and we will do Q&A about 5 minutes at 5 minutes towards the end. So Liz, take it away. Thank you so much.
Great. So it's lovely to be here with you all today, talking about, well, this, being socially close or trying to be socially close while physically distanced. And I want to think about these questions. So first question, is in-person communication better than online communication? A question of the moment. And how close can we be when we're online? I'm going to talk you through a thread. I'm going to unroll a thread of a presentation, and we'll get to some questions at the end. So the way I research conversation is by studying it in the wild. I'm a conversation analyst. So that means I study conversation as it happens, not simulated, not role-played, not experimentally produced, and not reported post hoc in surveys or interviews. My primary data as a conversation analyst is recordings, from single cases to tens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of people talking, interacting in real life. And after I've got the recordings, I transcribe them using a technical system that permits a fine-grained analysis of what people say and how they say it, and when and at what pace and with what intonation. And this can include the gestures and embodied conduct that may be working in aggregate with spoken talk. So let's start with a conversation. This is two friends, Hyla and Nancy, beginning a conversation on the phone. Now, as every conversation unfolds, I want you to think of it as progressing along an open road. Every conversation has a landscape to it, an architecture. And we know that different activities are likely to happen, but not precisely how or what. So here on the phone, Hyla and Nancy say, hello, hi, how are you? Fine, how are you? And there are three things about this conversation that are interesting. First of all, when these turns are happening, they're happening rapidly, about 1/10 of a second between each turn. Second, what they both do is reciprocal. So they both say hello, they both recognize each other's voices, they don't need to identify each other, and they both do the how are yous. And third, the way this conversation starts is almost banal. It's so recognizable that you sort of think, well, is this science? Why are we interested in conversations like this? But if you think about it carefully, every component of this opening of a conversation is data. So for instance, the apparently pointless filler parts, the how are yous, that probably shouldn't be answered with a monologue about existential matters, are telling us about the kind of conversation that we're about to have. And one of the first things that happened as the COVID pandemic took hold was the transformation of the starts of conversations. So we stopped saying, how are you, in this kind of filler kind of way. They were no longer indicative, like they are here, of the start of a no problem conversation. Instead, how are you became the entire purpose of the conversation. It was the reason why people got in touch. Okay, so how do we stay socially close at physical distance? I just want to show you some examples of the kinds of things my colleagues and family started to do and mess around with online because they were fun. And I was talking about this with colleagues at Typeform when we were putting this session together. So we decided we'd start to do synchronized Zooms. So, and believe me, once you have more than 4 people, trying to get people to say where they are in relation to each other on the screen so that you all can all point at the middle is quite difficult to do. And then we got more ambitious, and we started to make paper planes and have them kind of, knock people out in a Zoom. Because I have brother and nephews and nieces in the States, we started to do baking online. So we all baked the same thing, and then whilst we had a Zoom in the background. And then I've been doing walks with friends who I really miss. So this is me walking with a friend in Sweden, and we just took our cameras. The Wi-Fi was hopeless in the countryside, but nevertheless, it was such a nice way to try and stay close and think, thank goodness we actually do have the internet to enable these kinds of things to happen. So to get to the thread, the main point of what I want to talk about today, one of the biggest assumptions about online versus in person, and I say in person deliberately, not face to face, because when we're online, we're very often face to face if we have the video on. The biggest assumption is that being in person equates to better quality of communication. But I'm going to put something out there, which is that ineffective communicators are probably ineffective communicators, regardless of modality. There are lots of myths about what constitutes communication quality, even before we get to the differentials across modality. So what do we actually mean by a good communication? When it comes to considering remote interaction, the focus is on often already tenuous things. So for example, people will talk about you can't have rapport online. And instead of focusing on how people are actually just getting stuff done online, actually quite easily. What do we mean, though, by getting stuff done from the point of view of a conversation analyst? So I just want you to think about getting stuff done in person, first of all, and building rapport or building good CX. So here's 3 examples of a customer experience in a cafe. In each case, the customer has got their coffee or tea, but they also would like to use the Wi-Fi in the cafe. In each case, the cafe does have Wi-Fi and customers can use it. And I want you to notice as I show you these clips that the shortest of encounters can generate more rapport and the best CX than the longer ones. So here's one example. Cafe customer, do you have Wi-Fi? Yes, we do. Can customers use it? Yes, they can. Do I need a code or... And at this point, the cafe staff member points at the wall where the code is in a irritated way. Thanks. So you can hopefully see here that rather than just giving the code in like this, which is a second way to do it, do you have Wi-Fi, and just giving the code in response, it's taking longer and you're having to push for something that you were going to get in the end anyway, but your journey to that point of having your request met just took longer than it should. But now look at this one. As the cafe staff hands the cup of tea to the customer, they also say, oh, by the way, if you need the Wi-Fi, the code is this. So here, the shortest of encounters meets the needs of the customer. When you proactively provide information that your experience tells you the person you're talking to is going to want, you remove the burden from them having to ask, which also quite simply reduces the number of turns needed to be effective. And you've built a great relationship with your customer. You can imagine another type of encounter here in which the cafe staff starts to try to build rapport by asking the customer things like, how's your day going? Or what kind of laptop have you got? Rapport often translates into things that you should do before having a conversation. So build rapport and then have the conversation. But in fact, building rapport is a process. It's an outcome. Having rapport can only be the outcome of an effective encounter, and it must be reciprocal. So some people might want to chat about their laptop. You've got to be good at picking up those tiny nuances that display reciprocation. You can't build or have rapport on your own. So here's an example from Typeform, one of the templates, in which at the end of the template, the sort of questionnaire tells the person who's just filled it in what's going to happen next. They don't have to worry about, well, what's going to happen next now that I've filled in all these questions. It tells you that we're going to send you an email with the date and time, and this reduces the burden on the customer to have to push for information that they should be provided with by the customer, by the client or the provider. And for those of you who want to know a little bit more about this, there's a whole page full of things that we did while I was at Typeform, including this stop forcing rapport with customers. You might find that shorter is better. Okay, so assumptions about the constraints of remote platforms are often built off other misunderstandings and myths about interaction. So, for example, a really common one is communication is 93% nonverbal. People tell me this all the time. They assert it to me that communication is 93% nonverbal. So, if this was the case, then it seems logical that remote platforms reduce our access to resources for interacting because they reduce access to anything outside of the window that I might be doing with my hands. And I'm not sure what you can see because I can't see myself, but you get probably the point. But the thing is, this particular study about 93% nonverbal is a bit of a communication myth. So the person who published this study back in the 1960s has not only campaigned to stop people citing the statistic, but also it just falls over very easily. So Max Atkinson busted this fact that 93% of communication is nonverbal. And we need to myth bust anecdata-based assertions about how people interact remotely. So, for example, if it was really true that 93% of our communication is nonverbal, then we wouldn't be able to talk on the phone, we wouldn't be able to talk in the dark, and we wouldn't be able to call across up or down the stairs for someone to get us a cuppa. These things fall apart quite easily, but they're very compelling because they're easy to assert and they sort of make sense. But I also discovered that right at the start of lockdown, this is me, my dad, and my aunt on a Zoom, and my dad very grumpy, kind of not really engaging in the conversation and sort of looking down to the side. And me and my aunt did a kind of eye roll together down the camera because we knew we could because he wasn't looking. So it turns out you can do all sorts of nuanced things online, and we do it normally. We just perhaps don't really notice how much we're doing, even online like this. So what are these things again, these sort of things that we need to get, the things that we're getting done, whether in person or online? So a social interaction is comprised of a series of actions: greetings, closings, questions, invitations. And it's organized through a universal machinery that people deploy in an agile way. We do any and all actions with whatever resources that we have: gesture, embodied conduct, speaking, writing. Conversation analysis shows us that we need to accomplish pretty much the same actions, regardless of modality, across settings from first dates to healthcare. Being co-present doesn't equate to or guarantee communication quality. We've all experienced and observed awful in-person encounters. So think about multi-party meetings at work with a chair. Entire fields of study and self-help are dedicated to chairing and participating in a good in-person meeting. What does it mean to participate in a good in-person meeting? And again, you should know that being co-present doesn't equate to or guarantee quality, equality, satisfaction, rapport in the meeting just because you're in person and co-present. In fact, we handle many of the same sorts of contingencies in remote and in-person meetings in similar ways. So, for instance, we might tell the chair that someone has been trying to get in person if you happen to be sitting opposite the chair and you can see someone down the table has been trying to say something. Or we might do the same thing on a Zoom where you are not the chair and you happen to see that somebody else has their hand up remotely. You might have noticed that in pre-COVID times that when one person dials into a meeting where everyone else is co-present, it's a bit rubbish for the remote participant because the basic resources for interacting are now not shared. That person online can't access all of the cues to interacting that everybody else has in the room. And this is why hybrid models are particularly problematic. So if you have half of a meeting's participants dial in while the rest are co-present around one camera and one screen and one microphone, this generates the worst of all worlds because participants have completely uneven and unequal access to the resources that we're all using to interact. However, when everyone is remote, you might have noticed that you can sometimes see more. And there are some democratizing and other benefits to being online, so increased channels for participating in the chat, for example. You still need a good chair online, but then we're back to ineffective communicators are ineffective communicators regardless of modality. All modalities are not the same. They all afford and constrain how we interact. But we do need to think carefully about what is it that we're trying to get done, with whom, whether or not we're going to see the people that we're talking to again or not. And the things that we're actually trying to get done are important. So, for example, there's quite a lot of research now, as you can imagine, on telemedicine. So how do you actually manage to do something like a diagnosis remotely? And of course, there were lots of studies before we all got interested in trying to make assertions about online versus in person, where we could see that patients who can't travel were actually able to do a lot of work with their doctor, with a blood pressure machine at home, for example. Lots of things can actually happen, and we can overcome all sorts of hurdles, which I think is really important to keep focused on. Okay, I want to end with a little extract from this article by Alex Krotowski, a psychologist, who wrote about in-person versus online communication right now in the context of the coronavirus. So I think we probably know that it's become a truism that the internet and even so-called social technologies reduce social involvement and psychological well-being. We read a lot about that. But a bit like the communication is 93% body language myth, we do tend to assert things without reviewing the evidence. And confirmation bias is real. We seek things out that confirms what we already think we know or think we believe. So Krotowski reviews some evidence and says, and I'm quoting her now, in a recent issue of the Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication, an international team of scientists wanted to find out what helped people cope during stressful situations, face-to-face support or online support. The team looked for psychological and biological markers of stress response in students who were preparing to take a crucial exam. And they found that online support fared better than face-to-face. Now, this finding, she says, might be an artifact of an age or the context. And she says, I doubt anyone who suffered a loss over the past few months would prefer a virtual fist bump over a real one. But what she says is that the results of this study do show is that we're better able to cope with stress when we experience more support. And online, we have a lot of connections who are willing to give us a boost. So when you think about it, these results aren't really contradictory. And she concludes with this really nice statement. A mediating machine doesn't mean the death of humanity. It just makes the relationship more, well, complicated. So my conclusion, before asserting things about remote interaction, we need to understand much more about what counts as quality in any interaction in order to make evidence-based comparisons and claims. And that's the end of my presentation.
Liz, thank you so much. That was phenomenal. And I can speak for the audience just seeing the chat coming through. So many meaningful takeaways and really wonderful sound bites about how we can think about making every interaction count, which is what we talk about all the time at Typeform. So I'm going to start by asking a few questions that came in through the audience. And if you no longer want to share your screen, the audience can actually see your face a bit more. So I'd love to first ask, how do you believe we can build a meaningful relationship that will entirely develop online? Do you think it's possible without having any previous knowledge of the person before an in-person relationship?
It's making me think of that Netflix program, Love is Blind, in which apparently some people did get married at the end of it. I think none of these things are sort of once and for all. You know, we can meet people in person and develop a terrible relationship that doesn't work, and we can meet people online and develop a relationship that does work or doesn't work. I think it depends what your end goal is. Do you want to have a relationship that's going to end up in person? And you might need, and what kind of relationship do you want? I'm not sure whether you're talking about romantic relationships or others. But I think we just need to remember that so many organizations, for example, have only ever worked sort of remotely, in inverted commas, from the start. So imagine any helpline. I do work on suicide crisis conversations, and a lot of those interactions are only ever on the telephone. So, you know, they have even less access to what might be going on than we do with video. And I don't think anyone would argue that helplines on the telephone aren't able to develop really meaningful relationships in ways that absolutely help people in times of crisis because they're on the phone. So I think it's a matter of just really thinking carefully about the massive range already of technologically augmented relationships. And we sort of forget that before, I mean, I'm of course old enough to remember that sometimes we didn't have this, we had telephones and that was it. And so, you know, people, we got a lot of life lived just on the telephone, including really important conversations. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Next question. How do you distinguish authentic sentiment from sentiment that is more responding to social norms? Does sentiment analysis software distinguish the two?
I'm going to answer in a really extremely polemic way, just for the fun of it. And I'm going to put it out there that sentiment analysis is hugely problematic when it comes to looking at something like at least spoken. Let's start with spoken interaction like this. So lots and lots of software technologies offer sentiment analysis of something like telephone conversations between, you know, let's say en masse, like a call center or something, where you're trying to establish whether or not the customers are angry or happy or those kinds of things. And I've started to dig around into some of these sorts of software, and the first thing that you realize, which of course is crucial for someone like me who's through this conversation, is first of all how inaccurate a lot of these tools are actually disaggregating the speakers for a start into two channels. And then what you then see is that the kind of categorization of sentiment is often quite gross. So for example, I've done lots of work on people calling the doctors to make appointments and so on. And our project was all about what makes for a really good experience when you telephone the doctors and kind of connecting that up to survey scores and so on. Now, of course, lots of the words used in calls to the doctors involve pain, depressed, upset, anxious, uncomfortable, but none of those are to do with the sentiment of the caller. By the end of it, if they have an appointment and they've been dealt with efficiently, they have a really great experience. So I think sentiment analysis is used quite problematically and sometimes unthinkingly, especially when it comes to spoken interaction, where we just tend to decontextualize words and map them onto sentiment in ways that just don't really track across a lot of different contexts. Yeah. So more work is needed, for sure.
I appreciate that answer. So this one is, I find it really interesting, given that this is a conference that we're calling Meaningful. And the question is, would you recommend to ask people before an interaction what they consider a meaningful interaction, or does that defeat the purpose?
I'm not quite sure what the questioner is getting at. So before any encounter, ask them what would be meaningful for them out of the end of this conversation? Or?
I guess, and even in this, I guess I would add to that in this event, we're asking people what's meaningful to them. Is that leading the witness a bit? Is there a way that we might construct that sentiment to feel a little bit more authentic and extract a more organic answer?
I'm not sure. I think, again, I don't think I can sort of generalize across settings. What I do know is that quite often when organizations are trying to engage potential clients on the phone, for example, or in writing, they're often kind of putting their values out front in a way that is not enticing to the person who just wants to get something done. And in fact, the much more important thing is, rather than to ask what would be meaningful to you in an explicit way, is to actually sort of embody the fact that you really care about this encounter in the subtle ways that matter, with regards to really listening to what people are saying, not going off on a tangent when they're clearly not really that engaged in what you're saying, putting your what's at stake for you ahead of what should be probably the needs of the person you're talking to. So I think part of my answer, at least, would be a little bit like the build rapport. For example, I've done, a nice example is somebody phoning up the vets to say, how much would it cost to get my puppy vaccinated? And in response, the salesperson, the vet receptionist, I say salesperson, they're not a salesperson, but they are trying to get this person to actually come to the vet and spend some money getting the vaccination. They don't tell them what the price is. Instead, they say, "Oh, what's your puppy called?" And the person says, "Victor." And it should be really obvious at this point that this person does not want to talk about the puppy. Some people might say, "Oh, I'm really excited and I'm dying to talk to anybody and everybody about my new puppy," but not everyone wants to. This person just wanted the price of the vaccinations. So it's really important to think, what does this person want? No one size fits all. You need to be quite nimble in the way you think about those relationships at the start of encounters in particular.
Amazing answer. And I can totally empathize with that. I just want to know how much this is going to cost.
Yeah.
So our next question is, in a world of digital interactions, how do we design or create meaningful conversations between humans and machines to tackle everyday problems? Things like loneliness, getting help for simple tasks. And just to note, this individual asking the question works in this space. So I think partially trying to understand that dialogue.
Yeah. Gosh, that's a big topic actually. And the first part of my answer is to just recommend a colleague of mine at Loughborough University who's called Saul Saul, Albert, because he's been working for the last year or so on basically using I don't know the language for it, but things like Alexas and so on in the home of people with disabilities, and how they actually use that software technology to kind of get things done in their home environment. And I know that there is research in that area. So Saul would be able to answer that question more directly in that sense. When it comes to human robot interaction, I do remember a while ago seeing a study or a technology where a sort of care robot had been, I can't remember what the name of it was now, but basically the promotional video was an elderly person and a care robot, and the promotion was, look at how well they're bonded, and that just made me feel really depressed that like what really that's the future, that people who are lonely, hey, great, there's a robot that can help them out. I sort of the idea that might be the future makes me feel a bit depressed. But obviously technologies are it's really important to think in an inclusive and accessibility type ways about what technology can help people do. When it comes to human robot interaction, again, there's a lot of research in my field. Anyone, I don't know if the questioner, feel free to get in touch with me, by the way, and I can just put you in touch with colleagues who are doing this kind of work right now. I think one thing that's really important is to not build devices that interact in a weird kind of way, because we know as conversation analysts that some of the things that devices are already built to respond, how they're built to respond and how they're built to communicate, if you like, are not really very authentic when it comes to what people are actually doing in their own conversations. So I think that, I can send you a bunch of stuff, that particular questionnaire, if you would like me to.
Wonderful. I have so appreciated hearing you. I can tell from the chat that others have as well. This has been phenomenal, and thank you for this amazing session and for being with us for 6 months in 2018 to really help us. So this is our time. Everyone, next up we have Gautam Khurana. He's from Seahawk Media, and he will be talking about how to scale businesses in a highly competitive world. So we'll be back in just a moment.